He
I
set
just kind
himself
of
on the floor in
glanced
front of the
off,
audience,
looked up into the
body
crowd,
straight as a plank,
2 feet away,
and lowered his
and I
entire
just
torso
swing at it
onto
like at
two
a fly.
fingers of one hand. Then he pushed up, then again. The room went quiet in a particular way rooms go quiet when seasoned professionals realize they are watching something they have never personally seen done. He was not finished. He called up his student Taki camera and tied a blindfold over his own eyes. Kimura attacked with real strikes from real angles. Bruce intercepted them. Sometimes he slipped past before they reached him. Sometimes he met them at the joint, redirecting before they could finish their arc. The blindfold did not seem to slow him down at all. What the crowd was watching was a proof of everything Bruce had been arguing for years. Mastery was not memorized form. Mastery was instinct, timing, the ability to read a body as it began to move. Then a figure stepped forward from the far side of the room, a 4-time world karate champion. The room held its breath. The speed challenge that made a world champion look frozen. His name was Vic Moore, 10th-degree black belt, a fighter whose record had been built in the toughest arenas on the circuit. If anyone in that tournament was going to expose Bruce Lee as a performer rather than a real fighter, Vic Moore was the one. Bruce explained the rules in a voice so calm it almost sounded bored. He was going to throw a single straight punch toward Moore's face. Moore did not have to block it cleanly. Moore did not have to stop it. Moore just had to touch his hand at any point as it came in. Make contact anywhere, anyway, and Bruce would publicly admit defeat right there on the spot. The challenge sounded almost insulting in its simplicity. Every trained fighter in the room had drilled blocking strikes for years. Touching a hand as it traveled toward your face was not a fighting feat, it was a reflex. Except this was not about reflex. This was about speed. Bruce settled into his stance. He barely seemed to move. Moore raised his guard, eyes locked, ready. Then there was a blur and the punch was already there. Stopped a hair from Moore's face and gone again before Moore's brain had finished telling his. Hand to move. Moore had not flinched. His arm had stayed exactly where it had been a second before. Bruce reset. So did Moore with full focus this time. Same result. The fist came and went. The world champion was frozen in place. Not because he was scared, but because there was no decision to make in the time the punch existed. By the time his nervous system processed the threat was already over. They tried again and again. Every single time Bruce's fist slipped through Moore's defense as if the defense was not there. The crowd had stopped making noise. Hundreds of trained eyes were locked on a man they could no longer process visually. Years later, Moore told a different version of that day. He claimed he had blocked some punches and even landed strikes of his own. The problem was that no footage supported him. No witness backed him up. The hundreds of fighters in that room, including Norris and Lewis, had all seen the same thing. The world champion had been unable to lay a single finger on Bruce Lee. But speed was only half the story. A man could be the fastest hand in the world and still hit like a child if his strikes had no weight behind them. What came next would crack physics in the other direction. The punch that broke physics. A man named Bob Baker stood on the Long Beach stage with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. He had volunteered to take whatever Bruce was about to throw at him, and he was openly skeptical. He had seen every fake martial arts trick in the book, and he had not come up there to be impressed. Bruce raised his right hand and placed his fist against Baker's chest with about an inch of space between knuckle and shirt. Then he asked Baker to brace himself. What happened next did not look like a punch. There was almost no movement. A small jolt of the body, a snap of the wrist. Then Baker was airborne, slamming backward into a folding chair that probably saved him from going through the wall. The room went silent. Every fighter in the audience knew the rule. Punches need distance to build power. Bruce had just deleted that rule in front of them. A Stanford biomechanics researcher named Jessica Rose later spent months analyzing the footage. Her calculations kept landing on numbers that should not have been possible. From a single inch of movement, Bruce had generated over 1,500 tons of force, enough to crack ribs the way a child snaps breadsticks. The secret was not in his arm. The power started in his back foot, pressed into the floor like he was trying to push the planet itself. The force traveled up, through his calf, twisted through his thigh, accelerated through his hip rotation. snapped through his core, channeled through his shoulder, and exploded into his fist. Then his wrist cracked at the last instant like the tail of a whip. He had spent 15 years learning to fire that sequence with millisecond precision. Most martial artists generate only about 30% of their potential power because their muscle groups work against each other. Bruce had unlocked the other 70. He flipped the boxing convention by making his lead hand a weapon fast, accurate, devastating. He treated the strike like a fencer's thrust, sharp and direct. Hundreds of fighters have studied that footage since 1964. They have copied the stance, drilled the rotation, and practiced the weight transfer for years. Some managed to push a man back a few feet. Nobody in 60 years of trying has matched the original. Too fast for cameras, too lethal for stunt doubles. William Bowden had directed over 300 films by the time he showed up on the Green Hornet set in 1966. He had worked through the silent era, the talkies, every technical evolution Hollywood had ever produced. Nothing had prepared him for what came back from the lab the day Bruce Lee threw his first punch on camera. The footage looked broken. Bruce stood still in one frame. In the next frame, the stuntman was already flying backward. There was no movement between those 2 points. The camera department spent hours checking equipment, convinced something had malfunctioned. The equipment was fine. Film had been running at 24 frames per second since the 1920s, and Bruce's punches were finishing their entire arc in less than 1/124th of a second. He was literally moving between the frames, invisible to a technology built specifically to capture human motion. Drilled the same punch 10,000 times until it looked perfect in a mirror. Bruce realized that was the wrong question. The real question was what made a punch deadly in the first place. Speed came from fast twitch muscle fibers. Power came from connecting the entire body into a single, coordinated waves. So instead of training techniques, he trained attributes. Build the qualities first, and any technique would inherit them. The week became a machine. Monday, weights, never more than 8 reps. Tuesday, running. Wednesday, flexibility. Thursday, different muscles. Friday, the heavy bag. Saturday, sparring. Sunday was supposedly his day off, except Linda would find him cranking out fingertip push-ups while reading a book on the floor. Progressive overload became close to a religion to him. Every session had to be harder than the last. He kept notebooks like an accountant keeps ledgers. By 1967, he had compressed his workouts into 30-minute sessions so concentrated that visitors said watching him train was more exhausting than working out themselves. He carried spring-loaded grippers everywhere, bending bottle caps off with his thumb mid-sentence. He studied fighting like an engineer studies a bridge. Wing Chun's rigid stances went into the trash. The boxer's footwork came in to replace them. The fencer's straight thrust came in next. The body had been forged. Now he needed to burn the philosophy that had built it. The day he burned his belts and built a new religion. One afternoon in 1967, Bruce walked into his school carrying a cardboard box. Inside were almost 20 years of his life, certificates from Hong Kong, belts, diplomas signed by masters who had taught him as a kid. The students filed in for class and watched him set the box on the floor calmly, the way a man sets down groceries. Then he dumped, put the entire thing into a metal trash can, and set it on fire. The room went silent. Belts curled in the heat. The paper turned black. When he finally spoke, all he said was, "No more classical mess." He had a name for what was rising out of the ashes. He called it Jeet. The translation was the way of the intercepting fist. The whole philosophy lived in those 3 words. Most fighters wait for an attack and then react. They block, parry, retreat, and counter. Bruce thought it's already too late. The only winning move was to intercept the attack before it had finished launching. Catch the punch the moment the shoulder dips to throw it. 3 principles replaced the 10,000 techniques he had set on fire. Simplicity doing in one motion what others did in 2. Directness taking the shortest line between the fist and the target. Freedom becoming water that could crash like a wave or flow around an obstacle, depending on what the moment demanded. The mandate at the heart of it. All became a tattoo on a generation of fighters. Absorb what is useful. Discard what is not. Add what is uniquely your own. He kept Wing Chun's chain punches. He took boxing's footwork and rhythm. He took the fencer's straight thrust. He took judo's leverage and control. He stitched the parts together into something new. But Jeet Kune was never just a way to hit harder. He told his students again and again that the man across from you was rarely the real opponent. The real opponent was your own doubt, your own fear, your own loyalty to a single rigid idea. Then came the line that would outlive him by a century. Be like water, flow when you must, crash when you must, never cling to form. The old masters heard and recoiled. They sent their best students to test him. Each one left bruised and confused. His own students were winning street fights within 6 months. The system worked. Now he had to prove it in front of cameras and champions. The iron body is forged in sand, gravel, and steel. Bruce Lee could hold his entire body weight on 2 fingers while having a relaxed conversation about Taoism, not for a quick photograph. He would crank out 200 fingertip push-ups in a row, explaining the difference between classical and modern training to whoever was in the room. Each finger carried around 40 pounds of dynamic weight per rep. His breathing stayed even. This was his warm-up. The road to those fingers had started in his backyard with a bucket of sand. Every morning at 5, Bruce drove his fingertips into the bucket 500 times. After 6 months, when sand felt like nothing, he switched to gravel. The sharp edges tore his skin daily. He finished sessions with blood mixed into the stones. Most people would have ended up with permanent nerve damage. Bruce instead developed fingertips that could feel a heartbeat through clothing while being hard enough to shatter wood. Then came the steel ball bearing small, heavy, and nearly impossible to strike correctly because they rolled away the moment a finger landed off-center. 500 strikes every morning before breakfast. When doctors examined him later, they found bone density literally off their measurement charts. His tendons had thickened into something more like steel cables in human tissue. In 1969, he stood in front of a crowd holding a 1-inch thick oak board. No wind-up. He simply placed his fingertips against the wood and drove them through it like pushing through paper. The sound was closer to fabric tearing than wood cracking. People assumed the board had been weakened, so Bruce invited them to bring their own. The result never changed. Dan Eno Santo handed Bruce his first nunchaku in 1964. Bruce laughed and called it a toy. The first time he tried to swing it, he cracked himself in the skull hard enough to draw blood. 3 months later, he was using them to play ping pong, returning every shot, discussing philosophy between volleys. His most absurd feat of conditioning was probably the heavy bag. He owned a 300-pound bag that most fighters. Between takes on Enter the Dragon, he slipped away to apply numbing drops that barely helped. The famous intensity of his on-screen stare came partly from forcing himself to focus through plastic, wearing his eyes raw. He never told the crews. Linda revealed it years after he was gone. His enemies looked at his glasses and saw a vulnerability. They did not know the weakness had been turned over 2 decades into the sharpest sense in the entire room. Don't miss the videos on screen now. They're just as interesting. Catch you in the next one.